If you haven't already figured it out, it's Pride Month this month, along with Indigenous History Month. And I thought it might be helpful as we go through the affirming process for people to understand what Pride celebrations are really all about, because there's a lot of misunderstanding. This past week, I read a comment on YouTube written by a heterosexual white male, or at least I assume so, and he asked, why don't you be proud of what you've accomplished instead of showing pride about something over which you have no control? Now, this man's comment showed that he at least was aware that we don't choose our sexual orientation, but he showed a basic misunderstanding of what pride celebrations really are. And I can't fault him, because I think most people outside the LGBTQIAS2S+ community, and a fair number of people within it, have the impression that it's simply a big party with cake after church, which we have, to celebrate who we are. We've got parades, merchandise, a dozen or so different flags that you'll see, live music and dancing, and lots and lots and lots of beer. Not here, though. But a little trip through history will help us understand what Pride is really about, including the beer, by the way. In the 50s and 60s, for those of us who remember going back that far, being homosexual or transvestite was seen as a mental illness. It was officially classed as a mental illness in 1952. The concept of transgender hadn't been put into words yet, and transgendered individuals were simply seen as cross-dressers. Homosexual relationships were against the law, and police regularly raided bars and parks where gays and lesbians and transgendered individuals and drag queens were known to hang out. There were a couple of organizations that tried to change things in the 50s and the early 60s. The Mattachine Society for Gay Men and the Daughters of Bilitis for Lesbians were founded in the 1950s. Their aim was to provide a safe space to come out and to advocate politically. They were intent on proving that gay men and lesbians were suitable for positions of trust, especially in the government. So they focused on blending in. No cross-dressing, no holding hands. Even the names were obscure to take focus away from the sexual orientations of the members of the groups. Those groups were generally ignored outside the community. New York's Greenwich Village and Harlem were home to sizable gay and lesbian populations after World War I, many of them veterans. Even today, Greenwich Village is home to significant numbers of same-sex couples and is known as the cradle of the gay rights movement. And that's because in the 60s, gay bars, especially in the Village, were one of the few places where gay men, lesbians, transgendered men and women, cross-dressers, and drag queens could congregate in relative safety. The reason they were safer from police action than other places is that they were run by organized crime. And organized crime paid off the police to either not raid them or to tip them off if a raid was happening. So the bars would receive a tip-off, the lights on the dance floor would change from colored to white, and that indicated the patrons should stop dancing. The police would come in, line up the patrons, and ask for ID. Anyone whose ID did not match their clothing was arrested. If a patron had no ID, officers of the appropriate sex would take them into the washroom and check. And I'll leave that up to your imagination. Police would confiscate all the visible alcohol because none of the bars actually had liquor licenses, and they would arrest anyone not wearing 3 or more items of clothing that matched the gender listed on their ID. Minutes after the police left, the bartenders would pull out the alcohol that they'd hidden away, and the bar was back in action until the next raid. On June 28, 1969, at a bar called the Stonewall Inn, something went wrong. The tip-off didn't happen, and the patrons were tired of being harassed, and they rioted. The riot began as a woman being arrested shouted to onlookers, "Why are you all just standing there?" The riot lasted 3 days, and by the end of it, the attitude of the LGBTQ community had changed forever. Gone was the idea that fitting in was the best approach. The raid on the Stonewall Inn, with its clientele primarily consisting of people of color, transgendered persons, drag queens, and homeless youth, opened the eyes of the community that fitting in to mainstream heterosexual society was not an option for many, but that human rights were the birthright of everyone, not just those who could pass as straight. Pride is, at its heart, a protest against injustice. It's a declaration that we will not hide anymore. And yes, it's a celebration. We celebrate that during this 1 month, we are visible to everyone. We celebrate that on this one day, in certain places, we are no longer a minority. I think it's hard to imagine for someone who has always been a member of the majority how freeing it can be for minority members to be in a space where they are no longer in the minority. But for many straight people, especially those who are white, attending Pride celebrations might give them the opposite experience. It might be their first experience of actually being in a minority. And I've heard a number of thoughts and questions from people who are uncomfortable with some of what goes on at Pride celebrations. And there's the temptation always to judge based on what is acceptable in majority culture. I'd urge you, if you don't understand or agree with something that goes on or has gone on during a Pride celebration, to simply ask about what you're seeing rather than judge. I won't get into details at this point. We do want to get through the service and get to the cake at the end. But the majority, members of the majority culture, a few of things that have distressed members of majority culture are overt sexuality of some of the floats in the parade, nudity during the parade, except for the one year when they wore fig leaves because one of the police chiefs said they'd arrest people. Using flags as capes instead of venerating them the way we would the Canadian flag. The sit-down of the Black Lives Matter protesters during the 2015 parade in Toronto, and the growing exclusion of uniformed police officers from the parade and from security during celebrations. All of these celebrations of pride, all of these expressions of pride have reasons for being part of the celebration. And if you don't agree with them, if you don't understand them, just ask. As Trinity continues on its journey towards the vote to become or not become a member of the Affirming Congregations program, it's important for all of us to learn as much as we can in order to make an informed decision. Ask questions. In the near future, I'll be putting a box in the narthex. Please write down any questions or concerns you have, and we'll do our best to answer or address them. Or come directly to a member of the committee and ask if you feel comfortable doing that. You could also email the office, and Sarah will pass the question on to me. So I'm not seeing all the committee members in church this morning. Kendra's here, John's here, Wendellin's here at the back. Is Ivor here? And Jacqueline and Cora. And I'm not seeing any of those in church, which I actually knew about. I'll be at coffee hour after. There's some information on the table. There is, as I've mentioned, a cake and a couple of the flags, not nearly all of them. And we'll have a little bit of a celebration after, but we're not ready for a full-blown Pride celebration because I think it's important that we, first of all, understand what we're celebrating, and secondly, that we have buy-in from the congregation. So our vote is hopefully going to happen at the end of January of next year, and hopefully next year we will have a full-blown Pride celebration. So thank you all for your time.